I used to live in a small town called Fenter. It was a quiet place to grow up, with one school, a doctor, a police station, a cinema, with films shown a month after the national release date, 2 restaurants, and a host of local shops on the west side. Over on the east side of Fenter was the residential area with about 40 houses, the town bar, and the local woods, which are about 20 square miles and across. Even though I'd grown up my whole life playing in those woods, it was still easy to get lost in them. So my father used to tell me and my friends to never go past the creek that ran through about a mile in. Still, this gave us plenty of space to play in, and we spent most summers building tree forts and playing hide-and-seek amongst the tall trees. One late summer evening, me and my friend Jess were out near the creek seeing how close we could sneak up on the rabbits that inhabited the woods before they'd notice and run away. I'd spent about 10 minutes searching for one, and in my eagerness, I'd left Jess behind. She'd stopped to examine some odd-shaped rocks, and being impatient, I told her to catch up when she was finished. I was just reaching a hill when the creek bent and curved round to travel off north for another 3 miles when I spied one chewing on some leaves near an oak tree. I held my breath, grabbed my jacket to stop it flapping in the breeze, and began slowly inching towards it. I was careful to avoid stepping on any twigs. If one snapped underfoot, it was a definite game over, and with the sun going down, this would probably be the last chance I got to play before I had to go home for dinner. The rabbit was blissfully unaware of my presence, its brown coat tinged orange by the setting sun, ears flopped down like a hunter's hat. The irony didn't escape me as I crept up on it, silent as the leaves floating in the breeze. I smirked. I was about 4 meters away from it now, and it still hadn't noticed me. Not my best, but not bad. I slowed my pace even more. I didn't want to make a rookie mistake in my excitement and ruin this opportunity. The rabbit finished on its leaf and casually began sniffing the next one before digging in. 2 meters away now. The closest I'd ever gotten. I felt my heart beat in my chest, and for a second I was scared the rabbit would hear it, thudding against my rib cage, and he would dart off. I shook my head and continued up behind it. It was almost within arm's reach. I couldn't believe it. I stretched out my arm, fingers extended. Wait till Jess heard about this. I'd be the first kid in town to have touched a forest rabbit. My hand was about a foot from brushing its soft pelt now. I could see each individual hair on its back. 30 centimeters. I'd done it. I'd done it! Suddenly, an ear-piercing scream pierced the air, shaking the silence of the woods into shock and causing the resting birds to panic and scatter from the trees. I gasped, and quick as a flash, the rabbit was under the brush and gone forever. I cursed aloud and spat, frustration clouding my head. It was a good few seconds before I even stopped to think where the scream had come from. Then, like a falling tree, it hit me. Jess. I sprinted back up the creek as fast as I could. She'd been about 200 yards back when I last seen her, near the old silver birch. It took me about 2 minutes to reach the spot next to the weird pile of rocks. My brow was covered in sweat and my hair was messed up where the wind had whipped through it. But all I could think of was finding Jess. Even though I knew the woods were perfectly safe, I cursed myself for having left her alone. I spun around in a circle, scanning for any sign of her, but there was none. "Jess!" I yelled out, my voice traveling through the woods and echoing off the trees. It was getting darker, and tall shadows were being cast all around me like a net. "Jess, where are you? Call out to me! Jess!" I stood, and I listened, but there was no reply. I was just about to run further up the creek where the trail began to see if she had started to make her way home when I saw it. On the other side of the creek, about 50 yards away, it stood tall as the lowest branches of the sycamore next to it, about 7 feet up. It was covered in black rags, ripped and torn across its thin, wiry body, with a hood pulled tightly around its head, obscuring its features. 2 white, pupilless eyes staring at me from shadowed recesses, and I spied a flash of teeth. Long, slender arms with hook-like fingers splaying off of stumped hands almost dragged against the floor by its sides. I suddenly noticed an overpowered smell and wondered how I'd missed it. I'd smelt it before, on the farms, when the cattle were harvested in slaughterhouses. It was the smell of death. Thick and despairing. I almost choked, but my mouth wouldn't make a sound. I just kept staring at it, petrified, blood running cold through my veins. Even the birds had stopped yelling in protest, and now there was nothing but silence. It and I, locked in a gaze that I would remember to the day I die. I don't know how long I was standing like that. It felt like minutes, but it was probably only a few seconds. Suddenly, it shifted its weight and hunched down. For a brief second, I thought it was going to start running at me, and I almost threw up, uncontrollable fear racking my body, but then I noticed it had stooped to collect something from the ground. I cried out silently. It was Jess. Her limp body looking like a doll compared to its freakishly proportioned frame. Despite being thin and stick-like, it picked her up in one bony hand with ease, fingers clasped around her waist, teeth bared in a crooked, humorless smile. It opened up part of its shoal and pulled her close against its blackened torso. I got glimpses of a rib cage and rotten flesh. I reached out my arm as if somehow I could pull her back to me, but it was too late. It had turned and started to stride off deeper into the forest. Even if I had known that area of the woods and had the strength to move my legs, I would have never been able to catch up to it. And before I even knew it, it had disappeared from sight. Like it had never been there at all. Only the heavy smell of decay was left lingering in the air. The only evidence that I hadn't just imagined the whole thing. I snapped my head around and began to run back towards town. It was a good mile distance, and I'd never run that far before. But that day I ran and didn't stop. Jumping over fallen logs and ducking branches. I dared not look back. The darkness was almost complete by the time I burst from the undergrowth and into the town's edge. I sprinted to the bar and threw myself in the door, practically collapsing on the floor. I don't really remember much after that, but from what I was told later on, it took them about 10 minutes to stop me from screaming about a demon that I'd seen in the woods, and that we had to find Jess. By the time they'd actually gotten the story out of me and organized a search party, 2 hours had passed. Jess's dad shook me and shouted at me. Asked me what happened to his baby girl. I could only stare, dumbfounded and mute, until my own father dragged him off and told him to get a grip. The sheriff organized the townsfolk into 2 groups. They each took a section of the woods. I tried to tell them that they all needed to bring their guns, that the thing had to be killed. The thought of going up against such a nightmare unarmed was too much. I begged my father to stay, but he told me to stay calm, that I was talking nonsense. I was probably just in shock. In my mind making up stories to deal with what happened. He sent me home to rest under the watchful eye of my mother as he led one of the groups into the woods. 3 hours passed. I was laying in bed, still unable to sleep. huddled in my blankets, paranoid of every shadow and creak, convinced that the nightmare, was going to come back for me. The only witness to its abomination. I heard the front door open and the heavy steps of men entering the living room downstairs. I listened as they sat down and began to talk. Damnedest thing I've ever seen in my life, Jerry. I don't know what's out there, but it sure riled up the dogs. That was the sheriff speaking. What was it? A bear, do you think, Sheriff? I don't know the speaker, but he sounded young. Maybe one of the farmhands? Maybe. All I know is 2 of my best tracker hounds caught a scent, started going mad, tore off in the woods faster than I ever seen them run. And then didn't come back. Now we're 2 dogs and a little girl down. Jesus H. Then the voice of my dad. I eased up a little, knowing he was back in the house, and it made me feel safer. Chris said he found the poor girl's gloves down by the creek, right where my boys said they were playing. The unknown voice came again. Obviously Chris. It's true. They were covered in some kind of slime or something. Don't know what, but it smelled god-awful. One of the boys almost upped his liquor. All right, well, at least we know she's there. I'm not hoping for much, but I'll pray. It's one big forest. Chances of finding her are mighty slim. The sheriff sighed. Suppose I better go tell the family. They should be prepared for the possibility they'll never see Jess again. Fuck. No man should have to outlive his kid. And not knowing like this. Didn't Travis say he saw something big moving through the forest? Another unknown voice. This one knew. Yeah, he radioed it in. Said he saw some kind of, I don't know, giant moving in the forest. The man was half pissed. It's dark as the bottom of a well out there. Probably just jumping in shadows. No, more likely a bear or a wolf or something. Jumped her from behind and dragged her off. Sheriff again. My father spoke, voice raised so everyone could hear. Okay, let's all go home. It's been a tough night. We'll search again for her in the morning. Even if it's only a body we find, it's better than the poor folks not knowing what happened. I want everyone to tell their kids not to go into the forest no more till we know for certain what occurred. Understood? There was a mumble of agreement, and then solemn goodbyes. The men left and the front door locked shut behind them. My father moved about downstairs for a few minutes before climbing the stairs and going to bed. Before he turned in, he poked his head into my room to check I was okay. I just pretended to be asleep. I had nothing to say. I didn't even know what to tell myself. But one thing I knew for certain, I hadn't been hallucinating. I'd really seen it, and whatever it was, it had Jess. I waited for a half hour after I heard my dad climb to his bed before I sat up and switched my bedside light on. I crept out of my bed and got dressed as quietly as I could, then I descended the stairs. My father had taught me how to shoot and maintain a gun a few years back. Out here in the country, it was important to know. Hunting was a tradition amongst the men, and when I was old enough, my father would take me camping in the woods for a weekend of game shooting, like his father before him. I knew where my father kept his .44 Magnum and rounds in the garage, and after searching around for a few minutes, I found the keys for the lockbox. I opened it, loaded the pistol, and grabbed the flashlight before leaving the house and locking the door behind me. My breath misted in the air as the unseasonably cold chill hung around me. I looked at the forest. Once a place of fun and laughter, now dark and sinister in the moonlight. Branches stretching and contorting towards the sky like skeletal fingers. That thing had Jess, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do a damn thing to get her back. After all, it was my fault for leaving her alone out there. I swallowed back the lump in my throat and began tenaciously walking down the road towards the woods. Don't worry, Jess, I thought. I'm coming. As I entered the woods, I immediately began to question my actions. I knew that what I was doing was not smart by any stretch of the imagination, that my foolhardiness could very well get me killed. The thought of bumping into the creature out here alone in the dark was more terrifying than anything I could ever imagine, and knowing that Jess was in that very situation herself was the only thing that drove me on. I trudged on the familiar old trail for about 20 minutes or so until I eventually came to the creek. I'd never been here before in the dark, and although everything was where it should be, it looked different. It was as if these were my woods to play in during the day, but now in the dark, it was an alien place. This was its domain. I was a stranger here, unwelcome. This feeling was reinforced by the fact that I had no idea what lay beyond the creek except for what I'd seen in the immediate area from the other side. Carefully, I crossed the creek, the water soaking through my boots, dampening my trouser legs. As soon as I stepped out on the other side, I felt like I was lost. How would I find my way back? Which direction would I go in? I ignored the first question. I had bigger things to worry about at the moment, and decided to head off in the direction I'd last seen the creature going. I started walking, vigilant for any signs of movement or noise. I'd expected there to be animals out this late at night, but eerily, it was silent, which made me feel vulnerable. Every footstep sounded like an alarm, telling the creature where I was. I stopped for a moment and looked around with my flashlight. I felt like the darkness was swallowing me, that the thing sat just outside the border of light, laughing at my efforts to find it. I realized that if there was anything out there, the light would only serve to give away my position, effectively ending any kind of advantage I would have over it. After a pause, I switched off the flashlight and waited for my eyes to adjust. It was difficult at first, but after a few minutes I could make out enough of the forest to start slowly making my way through. It was about 10 minutes later when I heard it. A short, sharp yelp to my left in the distance. I paused and waited to see if another noise was made. A moment later, a snap echoed through the darkness, and a dull thump. I was not alone anymore. Swallowing fear, I sunk to my haunches and slowly made my way towards the noise. I had plenty of experience at being quiet from the rabbit game. Even in the dark, I didn't find it too hard to distribute weight so as to move almost silently. After a while, I reached a clearing where the trees parted to a grassy patch about half the size of a football field. In the center of the clearing was a rocky depression that sunk down into the earth. I was about to make my way over and investigate when I saw it. It was standing near the edge of the clearing to the south and was slowly limping its way over to the depression, dragging something behind it. In the dark, I couldn't make out what it was, but it was about the size of a child. Except if the child had been snapped in the middle. It flapped limply with every bounce like a paper fan. I swallowed a lump. Tears stung my eyes. I wasn't sure if I was more scared or sad. I prayed to God to not let it be Jess and continued to watch it as it reached the pit and then hurled the object over the rim. It hit the ground with the unmistakable sound of crunching bone. The creature bent down head first, as if to crawl down the rocks, and then stopped. Slowly, it stood back up and sniffed. I instinctively pressed my back to a tree, removing myself from view and strained to listen. I heard it sniff again, softly, and walk around in what sounded like a small circle, and then nothing. I waited for what seemed like an eternity. I waited. I was unbearably tense, expecting to see its milky eyes slowly peer around the side of the tree, followed by that big crooked smile at any second, or a long hooked finger to slide out of the darkness and rest itself on my shoulder. Nothing happened, though. And nothing continued to happen for the next couple of minutes. Gathering my courage, I hesitantly glanced round the truck, only to see the clearing was empty. I double, triple, quadruple checked the area, making deadly sure it was gone, and then I stepped out back to the clearing edge, making sure to keep low to the ground. To step out into the clearing was out of the question. It was suicidal. What if it was only hiding at the clearing edge itself, or waiting in the rocky fissure at the center? It would defy all logic, rebel against every survival instinct. And yet, I had to know. I'd come here looking for Jess. If I turned back now without checking to see if it was her, crumpled and contorted at the bottom of those rocks, then I may never know. The sheriff was right. The not knowing was the worst part. Before I stepped out, I pulled the magnum from out of my waistband and cocked the hammer back, being careful to mute the click by smothering it between my legs. When it was loaded and ready to fire, I began to slowly inch my way out of the safety of the tree line and into the open. I took a few steps and stopped, waiting to see if anything came crashing towards me, and when nothing did, I continued my cautious journey to the depression. When I reached the lip, I aimed the gun ahead of me and looked over. It was a couple of feet deep, about 10 or so, and was a little larger than I had expected. One side of the hole was hollow and extended into the ground as a sort of cave, large enough to drive a car through. At the mouth of the cave was the body slumped over a jagged rock. I glanced around again, making sure I wasn't being snuck up on, and then started to lower myself down. I would just need a quick glance to make sure it wasn't, or that it was, Jess. And then I'd leave. Run back to Fenter. I'd wake up my dad and the others and lead them here, and we'd kill it. In this cave, that was surely its dwelling. It could be in there right now, watching me struggle down the smooth rock. But I reasoned that if it was in the cave, then there was nothing I could do about it. I must be crazy. Fear consumed my brain so completely I must not be able to feel anything anymore, I thought. This was proven wrong when I slipped and fell off the side of the rock, landing awkwardly and sending pain shooting through my ankle. I almost cursed aloud, but bit down on my lip and shouted silently in my head. Luckily, it wasn't twisted, just achy, and I was able to walk on it without a problem. The last thing I needed now was a broken foot. My thoughts were so preoccupied with the sudden pain that I'd forgotten I was now right next to the cadaver. My leg bumped against it, and I spun around, gun at the ready, almost firing it off into the rocks. I quickly berated myself for being so trigger itchy. And then I looked down. Relief and repulsion flooded through me. From this close, I could see it wasn't Jess. It wasn't even human. Instead, I realized it was a large dog. One of the sheriff's hounds that had gone missing earlier. Its back was snapped in two and folded upon itself. Its snout crumpled back into its face, turning it into a flat, tooth-filled gap. Blood, fur, bone, and brain were spattered over it. Its eye positioned in such a way that it appeared to be staring right at me. I looked away and felt bile rising in my throat. The smell of death and decay was overpowering this close to the cave, and I dreaded to think what other corpses were nestled away inside. I was about to begin scrambling back up the edge of the depression when I heard a sob. I spun around and stared in the darkness of the cave. It sounded faint, as if it had come from quite a ways away, echoing through narrow rock passages until eventually finding its way to the surface. It came again. This time it was unmistakable. The sound of a child crying. The first thoughts to rush through my head were of joy. She was alive. It must be Jess, hidden away deep in this creature's lair. And as soon as the thought had come, I realized, with a fear unlike any I'd ever thought possible to feel, that I'd have to go into the cave and get her. I didn't have a choice. I just couldn't turn back now. I may as well kill myself with the gun I held in my shaking hand than live with the guilt. I pulled out the flashlight and readied the gun, switching it on. The beam stung my eyes for a few seconds as they adjusted to the sudden light, but I could see the cave went on for a few meters just before widening into a kind of large, rocky chamber that had passages of varying sizes, detouring off further underground. I entered the mouth of the cave and shone the beam over the walls and floor. The beam danced over bones scattered across the ground. It looked as if every type of animal in the forest had eventually wound up in here, torn apart and then stripped of flesh. I covered my mouth and nose with the sleeve of my gun hand and continued to walk. There were 4 passages. The sobbing appeared to be coming from the one furthest to the left. Thankfully, it was one of the wider ones, and I found I could comfortably walk down it, still have enough room to stand up straight. If the creature were to come now from the mouth of the cave, I'd be trapped. However, if it was already in the cave, then I was walking straight into its spindly, disproportionate arms. I swallowed hard and continued to walk. After a couple of meters, it turned right sharply and opened up to a small version of the chamber I had just come from. I was amazed to find it was full of items, watches, jewelry, passports, letters, glasses, clothes, books, wallets. It went on, as if a museum to sentimentality and trinkets. I picked one of the passports and opened it up. Paul Ashcroft, born 1972, Herronford, Ohio. Another read, Richard Blunt, born 1954, Westville, California. I shone the light over the letters, seeing the addresses were to places all over the country. Then it dawned on me. I finally understood. It all made sense. The reason I had never seen this thing in the woods before was because it had only arrived a short time back. It must have traveled from place to place, from forest to national park to desert to mountain, picking people off, taking their effects, moving on to the next town. It was like a sick scavenger hunt. It was killing people, then keeping their items as souvenirs. Another sob brought me back to reality, and I dropped the passport to the ground. I hurriedly walked to the back of the chamber I now called the museum and found another short passage to a medium-sized cavern. Inside was Jess, sitting on the floor, crying. She looked up when my light shone over her and covered her eyes. Please let me go," she burst out into fresh sobs, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. I stood paralyzed for a second. I was so intent on finding her that now that I had, I didn't know quite what to do. I decided I had best let her know it was me before deciding on anything. I shone the light upwards, illuminating my face. Jess stopped sobbing and stared. "Jess, I come to rescue you. We don't have much time. We need to go now before the thing comes back and finds me here," I whispered, kneeling beside her. She did nothing for a few moments, then threw her arms around me, her body shaking. I thought I was going to die down here. I thought it was going to eat me like it did the rest. I don't... She trailed off, unable to get her words out through the tears. I squeezed her back for a moment, then went to lift her. The sound of metal clanging against rock reverberated through the cave. I shone the light down, and my heart sunk. She was chained to a heavy metal ring pin that had been nailed deep into the rocks beside her. "I couldn't escape," she sniffled. "I tried to pull it out, but it's no use." I stood for a second, defeat washing over me. "Okay, I could go get help. Come back and—" "No!" she squeaked. "Please don't leave me here." Panic spread across her face, and it was all I could do to promise not to leave. I thought for a few moments, and then, realizing my only option, I took her chin and looked her in the eye. "Okay, Jess, I have a gun. I'm gonna have to shoot the chain to set you free. It could be very loud. The noise will probably attract the thing here." She said nothing, just looked at me. "As soon as it's broken, we're gonna have to run for the cave entrance and back through the woods." She looked thoughtful for a moment, and then she took my chin, kissed me, and nodded. I blushed. Sitting below ground in a monster cave, and I was blushing. I almost laughed. I forced the emotion down, just smiled, before taking the gun and aiming at the chain. "Get ready to cover your ears. I'll do it on 3, okay? 1, 2... A guttural moan sounded from the mouth of the cave, and it carried its way to us. I saw the color drain from Jess's face, and I knew mine was doing the same. It was back. Without thinking, I pulled the trigger. The gun cracked, deafening in such a small space, and the chain shattered. I grabbed Jess before she could react and pulled her up, sprinting towards the museum. As we entered into it, I dived behind a table full of bric-a-brac, pulling her down with me. No sooner had we landed on the floor, I saw the creature enter into the room and scramble over to the passage we had just exited from. As soon as it was gone from sight, I pulled her back up and pushed her towards the passage that led to the cave mouth. She didn't need to be told twice. We ran as fast as our legs could carry us. As the cave mouth came into view, a scream full of horror and anger rang from behind us as it discovered its meal had been stolen. As we got to the cave mouth, I could hear wood splintering and the tinkle of all dozens of tiny objects hitting stone as it tore through the museum after us. I grabbed Jess's foot and hoisted her up till she grabbed the lip of the depression and pulled herself into the clearing. I spun around and saw it exit the passage into the main chamber. Its hood had fallen down and exposed what can only be described as a half-intact, half-human face. I fired a shot off in its direction, and it screeched in agony as the .44 bullet connected with its thigh, knocking it back for a second. I took the distraction and spun around, leaping for the edge of the depression and grabbing a hold. Jess seized me by the collar and helped pull me up, just as I felt hooked fingers brush the bottom of my shoe. We started to run across the clearing. The sun was coming up now. The sky was pinky red, casting a slight glow on everything. We ran and we ran and we ran, and the whole time I could hear it crashing through the trees after us. If I hadn't have hit it in the thigh, I don't think we would have stood a chance of outrunning it, but somewhere, some god was watching over us. It was about 45 minutes before we reached the creek, and by the time we saw the edge of the woods, an hour had passed. I still to this day do not know how we managed to run so fast so far without stopping, but I do remember the adrenaline coursing through me so violently that I shook for hours afterward. When we reached Fenter, I fired the gun off into the air, and within 2 minutes, dumbstruck townspeople surrounded us. Some asking what had happened, others grabbing and hugging Jess, and most just staring blankly. When Jess's father arrived, he broke down and cried, holding his girl to his chest and thanking God and me equally for his daughter's safe return. When my father arrived, he took the gun from me, put his hand on my shoulder, He gave me a look. It was a look that said he didn't care what happened, that he was just glad I was safe. Regardless, we had to explain to the sheriff what had happened, and after we both explained our stories, a group was organized and armed, and I was asked to lead my dad, the sheriff, and 20 or so other men to the cave. I was tired and reluctant to go back, but next to my dad I felt safe. After a couple of hours, we came across the clearing and found the cave system, just as we had described. The museum was empty. The shattered chain was found at the back untouched, and a brief examination of the other caves revealed them to contain skeletons of other people, later identified as other missing persons, from the towns that backed off of Fenter Woods. The medical check showed they had been dead for days. The woods were searched all day, but nothing was turned up. That night, as I looked out of my window before going to sleep, I saw it again, standing at the edge of the woods. It looked at me through my window for a while, and I stared back at it, like when we had first encountered one another, and then it turned and walked back into the woods. I knew this would be the last time I saw it. It was moving on to another place, away from Fenter, away from this area. The woods were searched for another week, but nothing was found. The official report states people had been kidnapped and killed by a maniac who had escaped into the wilderness before he could be apprehended, although the people of Fenter never questioned our version of the story. This is my account. This all happened 12 years ago now, and it is but a distant memory. Just finished university and is going on to become a lawyer for animal rights. I'm working on the family farm after dropping out of college. I tell you this story not to entertain you, but as a warning. Next time you decide to go hiking in the mountains, camping in the woods, it is still out there. And next time, it might be your town that it decides to visit. Be safe. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video, or by listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. I know I haven't had as many updates as I would like to have on the channel lately, and things just kind of get really hard with shit that's happening in my family. But hey, I wanted to say thank you so much for being around, thank you so much for still supporting me and for coming back to listen to new stories. If you guys want to get updates anytime that I do upload, then please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Or if you're listening over a podcast, I think it's still a subscribe button or a follow button or whatever happen. Those happen to be. As always, I want to give a very big thank you to everybody out there on patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. A very, very big thank you to everybody there, and to especially Jordan Humble, Diana Kraus, King Crab, Calcifer420, Veronica Lynn Lopez, Marlon Chavez, Azazel66603, Ethan Leon, Polaris Prospect X, Blake Rattler, Viceroy Scorn, Samara Lynn, Disciple, SullyMan, Brandon Mendoza, BrimstonePandemonium, Caltuna, William Wellington, Scruffy the Janitor, Brenna Crow, LaQueda, Canizales, Smiley the Psychotic, Dante Kinkade, SimbasBloodyMojo, CursepoxPrimarch, M, Jedis Pet, Clonable, J Kearns, Mike, himbojerry, CrusaderChocobo, Remember the Sun, Estebean, Hour Minute Second Time, Seclude, Salty Surprise, Red Shadowcat, Turtleman, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Voice of Sand, Phycomel, Melted Lake, Tully Sue, Croconut 509, Stricken, Freddy Krueger, Hades Nephew, Tommy Walters, Acid System, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, Tristan Pelton, Ball Arms the Rat, The Ginger Bros, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kinchin. To all of you guys there, everybody who's down in the description, and everybody who can just give $1, I want to say thank you to you guys. And if you would like to join this list in the description, head over to patreon.com/MrCreepy. And if you would like to join this list in the description, sweet dreams.